Okay, this week we are going to talk about the role that timbre plays in what we hear and how we experience sound. Um, Timbre is extremely important. It is how we differentiate between the instruments that we hear, the people's voices that we recognize, and all kinds of elements to our day-to-day existence as listeners. And not only is it important to address in a physical in a scientific realm like this, but also in the world of audio recording and technology, we are reckoning with elements of timbre all the time, thinking about how things should resonate, how things should sound, how they should be EQ'd and sculpted to sound natural. So when we talk about timbre, we are talking about how sound basically is shaped. And that has to do with a lot of different things, but mostly it has to do with how a sound is created in an acoustic instrument or in an acoustic realm. So when we talk about acoustic energy, we're talking about how, of course, a vibrating source excites the air molecules around it. And the way those air molecules interact with each other depends on its environment. And so a violin is an excellent example. This image is of the inside of a violin. And what I have here is a mandolin, which is similar to a violin. It's just you play it with your fingers instead of with a bow. But it's not extremely large, but it has a big sound in some ways because of this inner chamber of because the body of the instrument plays such a big role. If it were not for the body of the instrument, you would simply hear a very thin sounding pluck of the string. You wouldn't hear it resonate into what we now understand as a mandolin or a violin. In this case, for the violin, you can see how not only how interesting it is, the shape of the violin body, the kind of wood it's made out of, the way that it's connected to each other, and even the varnish that they use on the outside of a violin has a lot to do with how it sounds. So a vibrating string is resonating against the belly of a violin as it's being bowed, and that is then exciting the air molecules inside the violin. Those air molecules are then basically resonating or vibrating within a controlled space to excite the overtones that we know of as a violin sound. This all has to do with the overtone series, and it's the way that the violin selects overtone from this list of possibilities. We'll get into that in a minute. Let's take a step back and remind ourselves that we are talking about visualizing sound, and how we visualize sound is typically through a waveform. We'll look at an alternative later, and that a spectrogram is also a way to visualize timbre. However, the waveform can show us a lot about the way that a sound is exciting the air around it. In this case, this is a sine wave, so it has a very simple shape. But waveforms can have all kinds of different shapes to them, and the waveform then determines or is a reflection of the timbre of a sound. Timbre is defined as the character and quality of a sound beyond pitch and amplitude. So beyond pitch and amplitude refers to the fact that two sounds can have the same pitch and the same volume, but be of different timbres. They can sound differently. For example, if a flute and a clarinet were to play the same sound, they would have different timbre. And because of their timbre, because of those overtones that are unique, our brains perceive them as different instruments. Right? We've been trained to, over our course of our lives, to know the difference between the sound of a flute and the sound of a clarinet. Likewise, the sound of voices are resonating in people's bodies in unique ways, and that's why we can recognize the voices of people that we know and love, especially from long distances, which is kind of interesting. So the timbre is a very, very important aspect of sound. We can visualize timbre by waveform shape. This is an example of a series of waveforms that have the same amplitude and the same frequency, but they have different timbres. And we can see how these bumps and grooves of the waveform determine their wave shape. All of these little, we could see that the flute is a little bit more pure because it has less bumps and grooves in its wave shape. The oboe is more bright and more maybe a different kind of resonance because of all these different nooks and crannies in its wave shape. Trumpet has a different set of overtones, and violin is different entirely as well. Things that help to determine timbre are the way that it's played. Is it played with a bow, or is it played with air, or is it a vibrating reed mechanism, or is it a vibrating string? Also, the material itself that the instrument is made out of. Trumpet is made out of brass. Oboe is made out of wood. Those two things generate different overtones and different resonances. This is highlighting the difference between a trumpet and a trombone in more detail. And we can see that there are more bumps and grooves here that show the resonance of this instrument in different ways. Trumpet and trombone are quite similar. They're both basically cylindrically crafted tubes of brass, right, that are coiled around, and they're very similar in that way, and they're played in similar ways, and they also sort of resonate in similar ways, but the differences between them are very, very, very slight. The trumpet is a little brighter, but slightly brighter, and we can see that in these little bumps of the waveform. So the overtones that, I'm sorry, I missed a slide. The overtone series is extremely important in that it is the source of all possible overtones. For a sound to not be noisy or grating or annoying, it has to basically choose overtones from the overtone series. And the way that an instrument, quote unquote, chooses these overtones is by its resonance and the way that it's made. So the note you hear on any instrument is the fundamental frequency. So if you play a C on a piano, that fundamental frequency is C, or whatever hertz number is associated with that pitch. The overtones are not heard as pitch, but are rather basically understood as timbre. They are what our brains perceive as timbre. We sometimes describe overtones as having frequencies, but they are not heard as pitch. They are heard in combination. They're heard in it's a lot like how light is a combination of colors, and we don't see each individual color. We see them all matched. The colors all mapped together. Overtones are similar. It's a very, very interesting phenomenon. And so in class this week, we're looking at how wave shapes can fit into each other as octaves and fifths and thirds and so on. These are determined from the overtone series, and as the series goes up into infinity, these relationships get closer and closer together. And so most of the time, the fundamental and maybe the first overtone will be excited is in the resonant chamber, but a different set of overtones will determine the actual timbre of an instrument. So another way to view timbre in a two-dimensional space on a screen, for instance, is through the spectrum. The audio spectrum view in a DAW, in a digital audio workstation, will show us the overtone series of a sound. Usually it's in color, and it's in a vertical sort of way. So as an example, I can show you from our classwork. We're working in Audacity. And we generated tones in class that sounded different, had different timbres, right? The wave shapes associated with these timbres are sine, square, sawtooth, And we even looked at a white noise example. However, if we look at their spectrogram, we're looking at basically which tones are excited and how much they are. So the bottom, this light layer here is the single fundamental of the sine wave, which is 440 hertz. Notice that our spectrogram reaches from 0 all the way up to 8,000 hertz. Of course, the overtone series goes much farther beyond 8,000 hertz. It goes up theoretically into an infinite amount. Our square wave is brighter, and we can see through its spectrogram that it has a very loud fundamental frequency, but the overtones above it are also excited in a very orderly fashion. In this case, we're seeing every other overtone in the overtone series lit up in this spectrogram. And it's very ordered, and you can see it in this way. So I think if I hit play, it'll play. It's very loud and bright. So the one below it is the sawtooth wave, and its spectrogram can show us about its timbre as well. All the overtones are there. They are all present in this sound, but they're still ordered, and they are, again, sort of pointing towards the fundamental frequency as being the present pitch. Last, we have this noise, this white noise example, and we listened to it in class, but so I won't play it here, but the noise, notice that it does not have a very ordered stacking of overtones. It's a very sort of a mess down here. And that is why we hear it as noise. It's why we don't hear it as having a particular pitch. We go back to our slides. So these slides are ways to show how a spectrum view can show us our sounds and how our sounds are selecting or resonating in the overtone series. This sound has a wave shape of this. It is showing, this is another way to see the spectrum view. And this is another way to see that same kind of overtone series. We also can talk about basic wave shapes and how they select from the overtone series. Our sine, triangle, square, and sawtooth waves. These four wave shapes are what I refer to as our primary colors of sound. And we can make a lot of different timbres by selecting from these four wave shapes. You can see how they select from the overtone series. This one's the most pure. This one's kind of brighter. This one's more bright, and this one's the brightest of all. And these next few slides are similar to what we looked at in Audacity, noise versus an organized pitch. So our basic waveforms are what we choose from to generate algorithms. They're basically generated from algorithms to create basic electronic sounds. Most electronic notification sounds or anything from electronic devices are generated from these basic wave shapes. And they're economically built because they're simple algorithms that can select overtones that are easy to program and efficient to program. But we can also think of them as examples of how timbre behaves and how they work with the overtone series and so on and so forth. And this is just a further example musically of the sounds that are within these tones, these wave shapes, and how that might map onto a staff. So aside from timbre, it's also an extremely important time to talk about how sounds begin and end, or their articulation. If you study an instrument in a studio with a teacher, they'll often talk about articulations, how the sound begins, how is the sound going to end. If you write music, you also think about articulations. How forceful do you want this event to be? How legato, how staccato, and so on and so forth. Those are subjective measurements that we use in a musical way. However, we also can talk about them in a physical way and an objective way on screen. and talk about how sounds begin and end. We call that the envelope of the sound, the amplitude envelope of the sound. So in musical terms, articulation is the change in loudness over time. The sound of a snare drum strike is very abrupt. Tap. It's an abrupt beginning and an abrupt ending, and the sound itself is very short. For a bowed cello sound, for instance, it's a gradual beginning and a gradual ending. A piano strike typically has a short beginning and a long decay. And that is all to do with the articulation of the sound. We call that the amplitude envelope, and that is our physical property of articulation. We have control over these aspects in an electronic environment. We can decide the attack time, the decay time, the sustain level of a sound, and the release time. All those things are engineered in the sound design phase of making anything happen in a DAW. We call that the ADSR envelope. And it's extremely important because it determines how that sound behaves in time. It's another further detail that we can engineer. And we can visualize that on the wave shape by the way that the sound begins, how long it takes for the sound to reach full attack. We can see how it sustains over a period of time, and we can see how it basically dissipates into nothingness over time. And so the ADSR module, the ADSR envelope, is a time function. It's basically how long it takes for these events to occur in any sound. So as we keep working in either Audacity or any other DAW going forward, we're going to continue to address these elements of timbre and articulation because they are extremely important to sound design and understanding sound in general.